This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen.
And this week's case is going to center around two locations in the state of Michigan. The first one that we'll discuss is Detroit. Detroit is the most populous city in the state of Michigan with a population of about 700,000. And of course, Detroit is known for its history in the auto industry, including being the home of Ford Motor Company, founded by Henry Ford in 1903. At one time, it was known as the world's auto capital. But lately, Detroit has had a major decline in population, really about over the last 60 years, and a huge increase in poverty, and actually has about 33.4% of residents at or below the poverty level. As a result of this decline in population and increase in residents living at or below poverty levels, the crime has seen a major increase. Crime levels have increased a lot. In 2015, about half of all murders in the state of Michigan occurred in Detroit. And right on the border of Detroit is going to be our other location for this week's case, Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan. Grosse Pointe, Michigan is very different than Detroit. It is a more upscale suburb area outside of Detroit and has a population of about 11,555 people. Grosse Pointe is obviously smaller than Detroit and only has about 3.71 square miles of land area. And the median household income is over $105,000. So obviously a lot more affluent area than Detroit, Michigan, where, as I said, you got a little over 30% of the people living at or below the poverty level. And residing in Grosse Pointe are going to be Robert and Jane Bashara. Robert went by Bob. This case took place in 2012, and when it took place, Bob and Jane had been married for 26 years. Bob was self-employed as a real estate businessman, and he owned numerous rental properties throughout the area, and he managed them himself. He served as president of the Grosse Pointe Rotary Club and was known as a philanthropist in the area. Bob was the son of George and Nancy Bashara. George Bashara was a Michigan Court of Appeals judge, so obviously Bob came from a very prominent family. He was this larger-than-life, gregarious person around the Grosse Pointe community. He was even known as Big Bob to the members of the Grosse Pointe community. Jane was originally from Mount Clemens, Michigan. She held a bachelor's and a master's degree, and at the time of this case was a 56-year-old marketing executive from Kima Services. And she actually worked in downtown Detroit, but it was a very lucrative job where she was making six figures a year. She had served as president of the Grosse Pointe South High School Mothers Club. Now, Bob and Jane had two children, and they were both well known in the community.
So how do we bring these two people that are prominent members of the Grosse Pointe community into this case? Well, on the afternoon of Tuesday, January 24th, 2012, Jane had been to a work meeting in downtown Detroit. She left this meeting at the end of the day somewhere around 4 o'clock, and that's when she was seen by her coworkers. On her way home, she talked on the phone to her husband, Bob, and told him she was on the way home. She also talked to her daughter on the phone. Now, her daughter, this was an adult daughter at the time. Bob gets home around 8 p.m. and Jane was not home. He thought, okay, maybe she's out running an errand, but after an hour or so, Bob kind of got worried because he expected her home. He started calling family, friends, their kids, looking for Jane, but no one had heard from her. So Bob gets really worried, and between 11 and 11:30, Bob calls the police because he can't find Jane. And like I said, he's just really concerned. And I'm going to play you a portion of where he called the Grosse Pointe police.
Grosse Pointe Park Police and Fire.
My name is Bob Bashara.
My wife is not around, and she's not answering her cell phone, and her car and her purse and her are gone, and I'm just a little concerned.
So Bob has reported Jane missing to the police.
Okay, so standard operating procedure for the police in this kind of case is going to be a little different than a lot of people expect. It's not like we send out a bunch of search parties or anything like that. It's an adult reported missing with no overtly unusual circumstances. So in most cases, the investigator would actually get the report the next morning. It's not necessarily something that even the investigators would have been notified of that night, because the vast majority of these cases clear themselves up rather quickly. We get them all the time, called overdue motorists or that kind of thing. And what ends up happening is the person went and visited a friend and didn't tell the husband, or, you know, the car broke down and they didn't know it, or something like that. There's usually a very plausible explanation, and the person isn't really missing.
Well, that's usually what happens, but early the next morning after Jane was reported missing, and before investigators even saw the missing persons report on Jane, a tow truck driver observed a black Mercedes SUV in an alley in the east end of Detroit. Now, it was reported by Dateline, and Dateline has an episode on this called Sex, Lies, and Murder, and it's a really good episode. But what they reported is that to earn extra money, tow truck drivers would cruise around the city before their work shift looking for abandoned or stolen vehicles. Now, they would tow them, and this is how they just earned some extra income. But this driver got more than he bargained for. He sees a body in the back seat of the SUV. So, of course, he's going to call the police. It was Jane's Mercedes-Benz SUV, and it was 6 to 7 miles from the Bashara home. Jane was dead in the back seat. Her purse and the contents were scattered on the passenger side floorboard. Police reported that the vehicle exterior was dirty, which they expected for that time of year in Michigan. But the dirt on the driver's side exterior was disturbed, and it's as if something or someone had rubbed up against it to disturb the dirt. There were no signs of a struggle inside the vehicle, so they didn't think that she was killed in the car. They thought she was just dumped there. She had obvious heavy bruising to her face and neck, and this would point to, if you can see it, there was most likely a struggle, and it was not an instant death. Now, she was found in the east area of Detroit. The east area is a rough area, and it's known for drugs and high crime. An autopsy was performed on Jane, and it showed that she died from strangulation, plus she received multiple blunt force trauma injuries. She had bruises, and she had a broken fingernail, and that would indicate defensive action when a fingernail is broken. So, in other words, Jane put up a fight.
So, as all true crime out loud aficionados know, when we have a female, in this case a wife, that has been murdered, where's the first place we look? Well, the husband. And how did Bob respond to this? Well, Bob has received this horrible news that his wife has been located deceased, and he cooperates with police from the word go. He walked his entire home with police, looking for things that appeared out of the ordinary, allowing the police to look for things out of the ordinary, and nothing was observed. Bob came to the police department and voluntarily gave a formal statement. And in that statement, Bob said that he and Jane had discussed working on their taxes, and he had told her that he would be home around 8 p.m. He had talked to her that evening after 4. She was on her way home. Everything was clicking along right on schedule. That day, he had been working on his properties doing maintenance. As we'd mentioned before, he was a property manager of his own rental properties. He told investigators that he went into the Hard Luck Lounge, which is going to be a bar that is actually housed in one of the buildings that he owns. And he did that around 5:15. He had a drink and then went back out to continue his work. Around 7 o'clock, he went into the Hard Luck Lounge again and met a friend in there, and they had a few more drinks, and he left there right at about 8 p.m. and went straight home. Bob also disclosed some sort of revealing information about Jane. He told investigators that Jane did smoke marijuana and that she smoked a little bit at bedtime to help her go to sleep, and he didn't know where she got the marijuana. He never really asked her, but he wondered if that might have been a reason for her to be in that East Detroit area known for narcotic sales. The investigators asked Bob to take a polygraph, and he did so voluntarily. However, the results of that polygraph were never made public. So Bob's laid out a pretty good alibi, right? He's working on his properties. He's in and out of the Hard Luck Lounge, and he's met a friend for a drink. So investigators have to confirm that. And what that'll allow them to do is eliminate Bob from the investigation, and they can start searching other directions for this person who committed this crime. And people who were in the Hard Luck Lounge do remember him in and out of it several times that day. The owner of the lounge, Mike, said Bob had been there, but Bob had told the police that he was doing some work outside the back of the building. But Mike told police that he never knew Bob to do any manual labor kind of things. He paid others to do it. The investigators look for people who work and live in the area, and they want to know if they saw Bob or anything unusual in the area, anything like that. And they start to get a little insight into Bob and his life. The neighbors report to police that they see men and women dressed in all leather with masks and whips, and they're going into the same building where the Hard Luck Lounge is located. And as we mentioned earlier, that building is owned by Bob. So the police are going to look at the Hard Luck Lounge in that building a little bit closer, and what they discover in the basement of that building is a BDSM dungeon. There were harnesses, chains, and other items used in the BDSM community. And they learned that Bob was a part of this community, and he was known as a dominant, where he had the, moniker Master Bob. This opens up the investigation even further, because now the police obviously want to know if this alternative lifestyle had anything to do with Jane's murder. And on January 28th, 3 days after Jane is found, Bob is named as the only person of interest in the case.
And a person of interest, I want to point out here, it means that it's someone the police want to investigate further. It's not to the level of that person being a suspect and they firmly believe had something to do with the crime. It just means that there are things that are suspicious and really need to be investigated to see if this person could develop to the level of suspect.
Right. And a lot of times the police will make contact with a person of interest to rule them out or to gain other information about the real target of the investigation. So when Bob learns that he's a person of interest in this case, and that's further than the normal suspicion that falls on a spouse of a loved one who's been murdered, Bob points the police in another direction, and he says, "Guys, I have a person of interest for you." And he tells them to look at a guy named Joe Gents. Bob told police that Gents had threatened his family recently. Gents was described by Bob as always having money problems, and Bob had even helped him out a few times recently with money, but Bob had begun telling Gents no when Gents was asking for help financially, and Bob told police that this made Gents very angry.
So who is Joe Gents? We need to look at his relationship to this family. And we know in the fall of 2011, so a few months prior to Jane's death, Joe Gents needed a job and he needed somewhere to live. And he was hooked up with Bob And Bob says, okay, I'm going to help you out. And the reason he came to Bob is because he knew Bob owned these rental properties, and that included an apartment complex. So Bob, in turn, helps Gents lease an apartment from another one of Bob's acquaintances, so not directly from Bob. And the police question Joe Gents on January 28th, and Gents denies having anything to do with Jane's murder. And he left the police department after being questioned. I mean, that's standard thing that happens. But a few hours later, Gents himself comes back to the police department. He said he wanted to turn himself in, and he confessed to killing Jane Bashara. But that's not all he said. He told them that Bob had offered him $8,000 and a used Cadillac to kill Jane. And Bob had told Gents of this deadline, and he told Gents several times of a deadline. He had to have Jane dead by the deadline. Gents told the police that he strangled Jane in the garage of the Bashara home, but he only did so after Bob held a gun to him and threatened him.
So I bet Bob's wishing that he hadn't turned the police on to Joe Gents at this point.
Probably so. So what Gents said is Bob pointed the gun at him and said, do it and do it now. So Gents put his boot on her neck and pressed until he heard something crack. He said she did fight him, and he showed the police some scratches on his body. He was able to give specific details, such as her purse being thrown in the passenger floorboard. He said there was a struggle outside the vehicle on the driver's side, which would match up with that dirt being disturbed on the driver's side. He said the boots he wore, he put them into a donation box. Gents said that he and Bob loaded Jane into her car, and then Gents drove the vehicle to where it was found. After he dropped off Jane and the vehicle, he went to a McDonald's that was close by. So the police have their man, right? Or do they? The police released Joe Gents. So why would they release a man who confessed? And there's several reasons the police would do this.
Well, there are several reasons. And I mean, some of those reasons would be that they need to corroborate his confession. People do make false confessions. I mean, that's a real thing. And they may not want to jump the gun and lock this guy up without having something to back it up. But I will say that after receiving this confession from Gents, I probably would have locked him up while I corroborated his story.
Well, and you can hold somebody for 72 hours, and I do believe they held him that 72 hours and then released him while they're trying to back this up.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of things at play there. What the district attorney's office is comfortable with, charging him and not charging him, and his mental state, which we'll get to later. But there's all kinds of reasons that they let him go. That's still kind of unusual.
Well, and the fact that they have already named Bob Bashara as a person of interest prior to getting this confession tells me that they know more, that there's something more going on here for them to have released Joe Gents.
So the other thing that comes up, and this could factor in as to why they didn't immediately arrest him, he showed obvious mental disabilities during the interview. And we later learned that his IQ is between 67 and 69. So that can be a complicating factor.
Well, and we do know the majority of false confessions given to police are by people that have lower IQs or mental deficiencies.
So it looks like the Grosse Pointe police are just doing their due diligence with Joe Gents. And they're going to do that by closely scrutinizing his confession.
And that's what they do. They further investigate. And they talk to numerous people who testified later on that they had never heard Bob mention Gents threatening the family or any kind of threatening behavior before Jane's death. And that would be important because if somebody's threatening your family, you're at least going to mention it, but they couldn't find anybody he had mentioned it to. The day after Jane's death, Gents was seen with either $800 or $900 in cash, and he purchased an expensive new cell phone. On January 26, Bob dropped off an envelope for Gents at the thrift store where Gents volunteered, and Bob gave it to a woman and said to give it to Gents, and it was payment for a job. Between August of 2011 and January of 2012, Bob had asked several people if they knew anyone who could rough up, take care of, or run over, or T-bone a female tenant who was making him miserable. During the same time, Gents began asking friends if they could help him with a hit-and-run job for his friend Bob, who wanted his wife killed. And Gents would tell people that he would get a few $1,000s and a Cadillac. Gents provided these specific details to the police, but he also was given specific information to his friends. And he told them, this woman, she's a high-level executive who worked in downtown Detroit. He was able to tell them what time she left work, what route she took to get home. He also mentions to another person about this wanting to help find somebody, take care of this woman. But instead of referring to the person as Bob, he referred to them as Bashar. It's kind of unusual that he would call him that, but that's another name he used for him. Gents had also told his landlord in January of 2012, when this case took place, that he would be coming into some money soon. The police go to that McDonald's where Gents said that he went right after he disposed of Jane in her vehicle, and they were able to get video footage, and it showed Gents go into the McDonald's. Now, those boots he was wearing during the crime that he put in a donation box, the police actually tracked them down. And once they did, they were able to forensically tie these boots to Gents and to Jane. The big thing, they found Gents's DNA under Jane's fingernail. So obviously, now it's time to put Gents in jail and not let him out. And he was formally charged with the murder of Jane Bashara on March 5th.
So, as if this case wasn't already a little strange, it's going to have a few more twists and turns. A few weeks after the murder of Jane, once Joe Gents has confessed and is in jail, something else happens. Another guy enters the picture named Steve Taboda. And Steve is a local man who owns a furniture store and happens to be the guy who hooked Bob and Joe Gents up together, introduced them to each other when Gents needed help. And Steve Taboda comes to the police with his own story. So Steve tells investigators that Bob comes to him and wants Joe Gents dead. He wants to hire Steve to find someone to take out Gents, who's confessed to murdering Bob's wife. So the FBI set Steve up with a wire. And on the wire, Bob said he didn't kill Jane, but he wanted to pay Steve $20,000 to locate a hitman to kill Gents inside the jail. And he said he needed Gents dead because his life was at stake. Remember, Gents is making these allegations that Bob put him up to this murder. They discussed ways this could be done, and they even talked about things like putting crushed up glass in salt or sugar so that it would kill him in a few days at the jail.
And if you watch that Dateline episode I was referring to, you can actually hear some of the audio from the wire that Steve wore.
So Steve assures Bob that he can find somebody to do it. And 3 days later, Bob shows up at Steve's furniture store, cash in hand, ready to hire Steve and a hitman buddy to take out Joe Gents. But obviously Bob doesn't know that Steve's been talking to the FBI, and he is arrested for solicitation to commit murder. So now we got Bob in jail for solicitation to commit murder of Joe Gents, but he's saying on the wire that he didn't have anything to do with Jane's death. Well, obviously, the police are not buying that, and before his solicitation trial begins, investigators are still digging into Bob and Bob's connection to Jane's murder. Bob had a ton of evidence against him for trying to hire a hitman on Gents. And this was just overwhelming evidence. He had the FBI wire. I mean, the FBI was involved from the very beginning. So he takes a plea deal and he's sentenced to up to 20 years for solicitation. However, he never in open court offers an explanation as to why he wanted to kill Joe Gents. Then Gents is offered a plea deal on Jane's murder for second-degree murder, and he agrees to testify against Bob Bashara. Gents receives 17 to 28 years for Jane's murder. So to understand what Bob's motivation in all this is, we've got Bob. We know now Bob's already pled guilty to trying to get Gents killed. The police are still convinced that Bob has other reasons for wanting Jane killed as well. So we dig a little deeper into Bob's background and we find out that Bob had suffered from erectile dysfunction and was interested in sexual play and acts, I guess the BDSM thing, that Jane really wanted no part of. And he began to go to these BDSM events and began having relationships with other women. And between 2008 and 2009, he had intimate relationships with several women that he met online. And he usually told these women that he was divorced or a widower, but eventually they all found out. And then he would say that, oh, I'm separated with my wife and we're going to get a divorce after kids finish school or that kind of thing. He always had some excuse as to why he was waiting to get a divorce from his wife after they found out that he wasn't a widower. So we have another person enter the story, and this is going to be one of those women that he met online. And her name is Rachel Gillette. He met her online in 2008, and they ended up having a serious relationship. Bob runs his typical story on Rachel and begins with, "I'm a widower." Later, he admits that he was at one time married and says that he was divorced and not a widower. And then Rachel finds out that that's also a lie. And he's actually still married, but they're going to get a divorce soon. So Bob used his usual MO with Rachel. They broke up several times out of her frustration with him still being married. He continually promised that he was going to leave his wife to be with her, but he never would. But she always came back because he told her how much he loved her and wanted them to have a future together, and he assured her that this divorce would happen soon. Bob said that he and Jane did not exactly have an open marriage, but she knew about the other woman and that they had an agreement. Now, this drew a lot of angst from Jane's family. Jane's family said publicly several times that there is no way that Jane would agree to an open marriage or anything close to that she would end the marriage first. In 2011, Rachel and Bob began to look for a house together, and they found one they wanted on Kensington Avenue in Grosse Pointe Park. They made an offer, and the seller accepted, and they set the closing date for January 27th, 2012. Bob even ran his typical lines on the realtors that were involved, and he told him that he was divorced. During the same time, Bob and Rachel looked to expand their relationship, and they began to look for a third person to come into this relationship. And what they were looking for is a person to live in the new house with them. In 2011, and another woman enters the picture, and this is going to be Janet Lehman. It's another woman that Bob had met online. Bob actually traveled to Oregon 2 weeks prior to Jane's murder to meet Janet. And during the course of this trip to Oregon, obviously there was a sexual encounter between Janet and Bob. And she said that the sexual encounter was rough and it kind of pushed her away from Bob. And she stepped back from wanting to be that third person in the relationship. She did tell police that she heard Bob on the phone talking about something that had to be done right away, and he mentioned a deadline several times. So the weekend before Jane's death, Rachel sent an email to Bob and demanded for him to show his divorce papers before she would sign any of the home purchasing agreement. And that was the deadline. She gave him a deadline. You have to show me this before I will sign the paperwork for our new home. Bob actually picked up the closing packet for the new home the same day Jane was killed, and he did that at about 3 p.m. Realtors had not seen any of the financing or financial paperwork for Bob and Rachel to secure the home because Bob told them that money was not an issue. He had most of the money already and would have the rest prior to closing, so he intended to pay cash for the home. So after Jane's death, Rachel got a PFA against Bob. I know some of you may be unfamiliar with that term.
Yeah, and a PFA is a protection from abuse. That's the legal or the technical term for it, but usually people just call it a restraining order. So if we say PFA, just think restraining order.
So after obtaining this PFA against Bob, he still reached out to her and tried to contact her to tell her how he loved her and how he wanted a future with her. But with PFAs, usually you are not supposed to have any contact at all. I mean, you can't call, text, visit, sit out front of the house and leer or anything, really. I mean, he's not supposed to have any contact with her. Bob tried to get Janet to hide Rachel from the police so they could not talk with her. He took steps to make sure that the police and media only saw positive things about him by going to family members, friends, and acquaintances of him. Bob asked at least 2 people to go online or call in anonymous tips pointing the finger at someone else, not Gents. Bob even did an interview with Dateline during this whole process, and that will actually come back up in trial. He told Dateline that he was notified about 9:30 a.m. on the day Jane was found, and he fell to his knees and was very emotional. He also told Dateline that he didn't own a gun. Both of those things would be called into question later on. And the police theorized that on January 24th, 2012, at about 4:45 p.m., Jane pulled into the driveway as she was finishing up talking to her daughter on the phone. She told her daughter she'd call her back once she got inside and got things settled down for the afternoon, and she never called back. The police used her cell phone records and the sites where her phone was shown being used, and that gave an area consistent with her home. So her cell phone was hitting off of cell phone towers near her home, as you would expect. And at 5 p.m., there were only incoming calls, so she made no phone calls from her phone after 5 p.m. Data was also collected from Bob's cell phone, and it showed that he used towers near the Hard Luck Lounge between 4:52 p.m. and 5:20 p.m. And it was after that he went to his home with Gents, and the murder occurred in the garage of the home. At 6:26 p.m., Bob's phone and Jane's phone used the same tower near their home.
So that tells us that both of them were at the home, and he's saying he never saw her at the home.
Right. And at 6:28, both of their phones moved away from the home, with hers moving north and his moving back towards the Hard Luck Lounge. So about 6:30, her phone continues to track towards Detroit, into Detroit, where it was used on a specific cell site near where her body was found.
So I guess the police at this point feel we finally have enough on Bob, and he was formally charged on April 17th of 2013, a year and few months after Jane's death, with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and solicitation of first-degree murder for the death of his wife, Jane Bashara. And his plea? Not guilty. So in the trial, remember we said Dateline would come back up? And Bob had said when the police notified him that Jane had been found, he dropped to his knees and he was emotional. Police testified to something different. They say he showed little emotion or reaction when they notified him. He also said on Dateline he didn't own a gun, he didn't like guns, he stayed away from them. Well, his own mother testified that after Jane's murder, she went to the safe deposit box and there was a gun in it that she had never seen. Now, Bob's father's dead, so Jane and Bob have access to that safe deposit box. They present those phone records showing Bob and Jane's phones both at their home at the same time. Like I said, Bob said he didn't see Jane at home. They also present phone records showing from September of 2011 until January of 2012 that Bob and Joe Gents were in constant contact. In fact, the day before the murder, there were 22 calls between Bob and Gents. The day of Jane's murder, the first call that Bob made that day was to Gents. Now, this is the man that he's saying has threatened his family, but he's constantly on the phone with him, and it's the first person he calls when he gets up in the morning. Then they present all of this other testimony that we've already talked about, what Rachel said and Janet. They had a total of 74 witnesses and 460 exhibits. And for those of you who don't watch court cases or have not been in a courtroom, that is a lot. Just take my word for it. That is a numerous amount of witnesses and exhibits. But Gents, who part of his plea deal was to testify against Bob, refused to testify against Bob. The prosecution did not force Gents to testify. They felt that they had enough to take it to trial without Gents, and I'm sure there are several reasons they didn't push the issue. Probably with him not being cooperative, if they put him on the stand, there's no way they could predict what he might say. Bob's defense was he had no reason to kill Jane. She knew of his relationship with Rachel. He had been divorced before, so he knew how to get a divorce if that's what he was looking to do. There was testimony from a friend of Jane's that said Jane had told her Bob wanted them to go to a key party. A key party, never been to one myself, but it's where all of the people who arrive, couples, put their keys in a pot or a bowl, and another person draws it out, and whoever's key they get is the person that they hook up with or go home with for that day. But Jane tells her friend she wanted nothing to do with the party, and Bob could do what he wanted. So that kind of goes to Bob saying, hey, Jane knew my lifestyle. He said his involvement in the BDSM community had absolutely nothing to do with the murder of Jane, and the prosecution was just bringing it up to tarnish his reputation. But the prosecution said it had a lot to do with Jane's murder. Bob wanted Jane out of the way so he could fully immerse himself in this BDSM lifestyle and be with Rachel, who was accepting of this lifestyle, and they could do this together. Well, the trial ended with Bob being found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, plus other years for all the other charges. And of course, Bob appeals his conviction. But that's not the end of the case. Like we told you, there are twists. So let's add another one. After Bob's trial, Gents sends an affidavit to the judge saying he was coached by the police and it was him and him alone that was guilty of Jane's murder. He said he just could not go on knowing Bob was in prison when he had nothing to do with Jane's murder. Gents's affidavit said he killed Jane because he was mad at Bob. He said Bob owed him money for some odd jobs he performed, so Gents went to the Bashara home looking for something of the same value as what Bob owed him, and he was in the garage. Jane comes into the garage and she confronted Gents, so he got angry and he killed her. The judge calls a special hearing for this, and Bob's attorneys are like, hey, we want a new trial. I mean, this is significant. The judge reminds Gents, and remember, he has a lower IQ and diminished capacity, so the judge reminds him that his plea deal could be revoked and that this was not a game to play, and she wasn't playing with him. And if you watch that Dateline episode and you hear the judge, I really like this judge, by the way. Gents retracts the affidavit. He said he had somebody write it and he signed it and was hoping that it would get his case back into court so he could maybe get less time. He also said he didn't really read the affidavit and only signed it because he was mad at Wayne County District Attorney and the Grosse Pointe Police. Gents said, "My original story I told you is the truth." And Gents goes on to reiterate, Bob let Gents into the Bashara home garage, and the pretense was they were going to move boxes. Well, Jane comes into the garage, and she and Bob get in an argument. Bob then points the gun at Gents and said to do it now, so Gents felt he had no choice. I mean, it was him or Jane, so he killed Jane. Bob was denied a new trial, and his appeal was denied. And in August of 2020, one more thing happens in this case. Bob Bashara died after being brought to the hospital from prison, and he had had liver issues and other health problems. Bob was 62 years old, and he was still claiming his innocence. Joe Gents, he is still in prison, and his earliest possible release date would be March of 2029.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this week's case, and as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.